You should always put others first. Gunnar was a tall, soft-spoken young man in his early 20s and was not that far removed from living in his parents' home. He appeared much less confident and sure of himself when he walked into the therapist's office than one might assume he should be. He prefaced his current feelings of depression and overall hopelessness with a long and at times confusing story of growing up in a turbulent household where no one seemed to be comfortably in charge. Gunnar began to feel strangely responsible for what appeared to be able-bodied parents. As his story continued, it came out that Gunnar was told repeatedly that he should always put others' needs first, and it appeared that he took this mantra to a literal extreme. As a result, he became the family's primary provider during his high school years and took on an incredible amount of physical and mental stress to ensure everything ran correctly and smoothly in the family. Gunnar did all this while going to school during the day and working full-time hours at a restaurant at night. When the therapist asked about his parents under the assumption that they must have been sick or elderly for him to assume this role, was surprised to hear that they just took it easy and let him start take care of them for seemingly no good reason. Gunnar could not reconcile their apparent taking advantage of him for their own laziness and lack of personal responsibility for not only his younger siblings, but also for their own self-care and kept. Gunnar kept reflecting back to this value that he had accepted as a straight and universal truth. As a result, he had a history of painfully imbalanced relationships with employers and friends who had shamelessly used and abused him into a perpetual state of exploitation of his time, money, and emotional resources. Even worse, Gunnar felt a strange sense of guilt and shame over seemingly not being able to enact his parents' values and make their version of life work, and was in a constant state of self-questioning. The above example may seem extreme in its black and white application, as few believe that you should apply this piece of moral direction in every single relationship and situation. But I can say without a shadow of a doubt that one of the biggest issues I personally encounter in trying to treat depression and anxiety is the problem of overgiving. This will be a difficult subject, unselfishness and doing this very thing of putting others first, to discuss without tapping into all sorts of religious and moral training that we have all heard about since we were children, from a variety of respectable authority figures. There is also an unreasonable and excessive negative definition of selfishness that makes looking out in a completely necessary and healthy way for oneself a thing of shame and guilt as well. As a result, I will try to demythologize this saying in a way that does not devalue taking others' welfare into extreme consideration, does not discard the concept of self-sacrifice that is a core tenet of my own and many others' faith, and is also a necessary component of parenting and child-rearing as well. As I said, the real problem, as I see it, is overgiving, and not giving itself. In the vignette above, the problem was not the young man's attempt to give something meaningful and valuable to his family, but that he extremely overgave. This ended up being a big part of his personal pathology and depression that had to be deconstructed in therapy. The first problem that should be very apparent in reading this vignette was that his parents were absolutely promoting a value that they themselves had no intention of living or embodying. They were using this value to exploit and manipulate their own son into inappropriately taking care of needs they were more than capable of meeting on their own. This highlights the basic problem of you trying to put others' needs first and then putting their own needs first as well, at the very same time, and what this ends up creating. The obvious answer is a lopsided distribution of resources. Most people who talk up this value have a subtle expectation that other people around them will do the same thing, and thus we will all be part of a social circle of mutual consideration and care for one another's neighbor, and sort of assume that this is already a given. What ends up happening is that someone else looks out for their own welfare, in maybe even a natural and not excessively self-concerned way, and they receive a second helping of consideration, and the giver ends up with an empty plate, and the relationship is thrust into a strange imbalance that causes uncomfortable anxiety and tension. Understanding this, let's take a shot at the bad rap that selfishness gets in everyday conversation and understanding. We usually interpret this word as automatically meaning that someone is being completely and inappropriately concerned with themselves, and that they are being unhealthily narcissistic, failing to treat others with respect and normal consideration. I would argue that we all necessarily selfish in that we have a life to live with our own need to develop skills and abilities, both cognitive and emotional, to survive and thrive in this world. We also have to cultivate our own interests, talents, and dreams, or we would be little serious value to the others around us, and we would never build any real resources to share with anyone around us in the first place. Developing the self is necessary and a prime task to be achieved in both the words of faith and psychotherapy that I live in. It is also the prime task of personality development that we work towards achieving with our children. There is a difference between normal levels of developing oneself for the purpose of being a healthy and functioning person versus being abnormally unaware or unconcerned about the well-being of those around them and taking excessively from them for one's own gratification. One of my other deep convictions about this value is the reality that all relationships have built-in self-interest that causes the relationship to exist in the first place. For example, take romantic relationship between opposite sexes or same sex, it does not matter. The genesis of any romantic relationship is that person A identifies that they have some desire or need that they want to have satisfied, and that they need person B to achieve meeting those needs. If they didn't have a core desire or need, then there would never be any reason for a relationship to be initiated in the first place. If person A always puts others first, then they would never have need to seek out a relationship to begin with, because having a desire in the first place would be a violation of the value. Furthermore, person A would have no say in who they had a relationship with either, and would have to take the first offer from whatever person stumbled across them, in this case, person B. And person B then decided they wanted whatever resources and characteristics that person A had. Therefore, living this value would mean that someone, person A, would have no literal say over whom they had a relationship with. Person A would be at the mercy of others and to the fate of whomever chose them, and that they would be rendered unable to say no to any request or demand, or simply because you cannot put your own needs, preferences, and even personal health and safety before the other person's willfulness. This sounds bizarre, doesn't it? Realistically, in marriage counseling, the start of all these unions begins with someone wanting their reproductive drive needs met and making an overture to someone else who counters with them wanting their own reproductive drive met. If both believe that they can successfully get their own needs met and pay the price that the other person expects, then an entry-level deal is struck and the relationship tentatively begins. I have never, ever encountered a person A that found absolutely nothing attractive or beneficial about person B and merely took up a relationship with them out of some completely altruistic desire to serve others slavishly and for no personal gain. Never. Now, this is not to say that there is not some level of desired consideration and occasional selflessness within these relationships. Because if two people want different or competing things, then someone may have to make a compromise for the betterment of their partner or the betterment of the relationship. This would be normal and healthy, we would all agree. But what would happen if one person always puts their partner's needs first? Well, the first thing that would happen is the other person would have to decide whether to match this and join them in this strange exercise of never wanting anything for yourself and always wanting what was received without a return. If person B doesn't match this flow of unselfish giving, then there will be an incongruence and unfairness at the heart of this relationship, with one person being a consumer, and this makes them the lesser person, right? And actually promotes them being narcissistic and childish, in that they are now taking more than they are giving, and is personally destructive to person B's character. This good-hearted intention is now causing the moral and spiritual destruction of your partner, and how could you stand by and watch someone you presumably love become damaged by the very act of unselfishness that you are trying to implement? Taking this saying to the extreme would mean that you would also be accepting that everything you have and are should be sacrificed or outright given to others. Do you truly believe that putting others first should mean that you should freely give all of your worldly possessions away to whomever asks them or wants them? How about your time? Should you allow all others to control your time schedule to the point where you forego working or caring for children or elderly relatives? And your money? Should you have an open checkbook for whomever wants to dip into it? Looking past these physical resources, does this value mean that you should have no inner space that is yours and stay private safely to yourself? Putting others first would mean giving up whatever information or emotional responses that others want as well. All of this, of course, sounds absurd, and while it sounds like a wonderful thing to do in general, it's a completely unwieldy thing to do, actually practiced literally. It is impossible to be a functioning person when you always sacrifice whatever you have for others on their demand or even your perception. A healthier and more ethical approach to relationships in general is to teach people to negotiate relationships that are much more quid pro quo in nature. While we can dig up and discuss the actual definition of this Latin term and how it, at its root, of our entire legal system, the way I usually describe it to people is recounting a scene from The Godfather, where Don Corleone first established himself in his home neighborhood. He's shown setting up a storefront office and sitting with his right-hand man when a distraught and dramatic old woman came in and immediately pronounced the end of her world because her landlord raised her rent and she will surely fall into poverty and end up homeless and could die cold, hungry, and abandoned. Corleone promised he would intervene and sent for the landlord, who proved to be completely deaf to the Godfather's orders. To the Godfather's offer that if the landlord will do him a favor by not raising the old woman's rent, then he would return this favor, and I will take care of you. The landlord refused angrily and stormed out of the storefront, to which Corleone rolled his eyes at his bodyguard. Maybe an hour later, presumably after someone told the crotchety old man that he just insulted a mob boss, the landlord came hurriedly back into the office and begged for forgiveness and insisted that he will never charge the old widow another dime of rent as long as she lived. The Godfather tried to explain over and over again that this is too much and that he will repay the favor graciously, and even if he just keeps the rent the same. But the landlord wouldn't hear a word of it, and left fearfully, insisting the old woman will live rent-free. After he left, Corleone just looked at his sidekick and shook his head with exasperation that people just can't get the concept of, you wash my hand, and I'll wash yours. And the sidekick raised his hands with similar bewilderment. While I am not a marriage counselor by trade, I've done enough work with couples, married, unmarried, and cohabitating, to see that the number one issue that causes breakups and divorce is a belief that the relationship isn't fair, and that this sense of unfairness is what brings about the anger and unhappiness at the root of the conflict. When there is an imbalance in either affection, energy, commitment, or simply how much they do for me versus how much I do for them, it goes against human nature. It brings about feelings that other the other person either doesn't care enough about us or that they are selfish. Maybe they are just incapable of holding up their end of the bargain. The key to helping any couple fix their relationship and stay together is bringing about fairness and equality in the both people should strive to treat each other evenly and getting it as close to even as it can be will almost always convince the couple to stay together with mutual respect and affection. The same ethic and dynamics apply to relationships between employers and employees, and the expectation of the equal giving and receiving between both is the glue that holds the relationship together. A downturn in production or attendance will cause a problem for the employer. Similarly, overwork or a reduction in pay or benefits will cause a problem for the employee. Obviously, the simplest version of always putting others first would not work smoothly in either of these foundational relationships that we all generally engage in. If we have made a substantial case that is saying is a well-meaning principle that doesn't work in reality, then what should we replace it with that would actually work better? My belief is that we should teach, and indeed I do teach this in my sessions with my clients regularly, people to instead expect fairness and deliver fairness in their interactions with other people and even institutions. I would personally shift this saying from always put others first to always keep the welfare of others in mind when you are making decisions to be fair. Or make sure your relationships are fair so that they are healthy. These seem much more useful and realistic and help us build quid pro quo relationships that benefit others as much as they benefit us, and that don't force anyone into being a self-centered consumer who will drive others away, or selfless, depressed martyr that will eventually be the one who flees from frustration and exhaustion. These would prepare a person, if used wisely and consistently, to build necessary, beneficial to oneself relationships with an empathetic balance and foresight that has to be equally good for both sides if it is going to work and going to last. Gunnar began to work his way out of this emotional and cognitive straitjacket that his parents selfishly manipulated him into. He began, with help, to understand human nature and that the way his relationships worked if he brought none of himself to the table. He had an eye-opening meeting with his supervisor and the owner of the business one day when he was concerned that his work demands kept rising while his pay remained substandard. They didn't deny that the relationship was unfair to Gunnar at the heart of it, but implored him to trust us that it will get better, and gave him vague promises about promotions and bonuses down the road. These promises required Gunnar to keep overproducing in their favor, of course, and it had no real concrete timeline of when he could expect to earn more, or what he would have to do to get promoted, or even specifics of what that promotion would do. Gunnar began to see that if they couldn't make it fair now, then there wasn't much reason to believe they would somewhere in the future. Through counseling, he also became more and more aware of his own value and how responsible and productive employee he truly was, and this spurred him even further away from the instinctive self-sacrifice toward wanting to be treated fairly. He began setting limits with his employer and resisted being taken advantage of despite their complaints and attempts to apply pressure on him to keep giving and giving with no return on his investment. Eventually, Gunnar began to look for a better job and was able, with his improved self-confidence, to negotiate a much better position with an increase in salary. The supervisors were aware that the job duties, atmosphere, and compensation had to match up with what they were expecting from him, and he transitioned nicely into the new position. Slowly, Gunnar set firm boundaries with both family and friends and expected others to take care of themselves as the adults they were, and limited his selflessness to situations where charity was deserved and absolutely needed. As a result, his depressive symptoms decreased, and his mood and energy increased. He became much better at building healthy interactions and unions with others and was able to leave therapy successfully.